Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Rochelle from Rochelle.Handmade.Designs, and in this video we will be sewing our second version of the Boxy top for the spring top series. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the supplies, the tools, and the fabric that you will need in order to construct this garment. Okay, so let's talk about the supplies that you will need in order to construct your Boxy top, which is the first top in our part 2 spring top series. So the first thing that you will need is your pattern. This pattern is Simplicity 8602. You will also need your instructions if you want to follow along with the instructions, because I will be making a slight modification to this pattern. Also, you will need rotary cutters if you are cutting with rotary cutters, one for paper, one for fabric. I never mix the two. You'll need pattern weights. I'm just using some coins from my husband. You'll also need a pencil or a pen for the modifications I will be making and drafting a tie-in for the back. You will need a disappearing water-soluble ink, disappearing marker or ink. I use 2 pairs of scissors, one for paper, one for fabric. Never mix the two on that. A seam ripper, just in case you make a mistake and you need to rip out the seams. You'll also need your thread clippers for the sewing machine and a point turner. Now, I did get some paper. This is just regular packing paper that I have had. You can also use any type of paper in order to enlarge your pattern, make pattern pieces. So I'm just using this brown paper that I have from when I moved. I kept some of the packing paper. And you'll also need some tape. That's all the supplies that you will need in order to construct this Boxy top. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do is go ahead and place your pattern piece down. Now, I have to make modifications to my pattern simply because the first thing is I picked up the wrong sides for my pattern piece, and this pattern is no longer available in the pattern drawer. So what I have to do is make some modifications in order for this top to fit me. So the first thing I did was marked out where my bust line is. So here is the bust line right here. So I took my ruler and made a straight line across at the bust. So I already did it, so go ahead and make a straight line across. So then I went down to the waistline, which is right here, made a straight line across with my ruler as well. Made a straight line across. And then I went down to where it says view C. And what I did was I took my measuring tape and measured from the top of the sleeve all the way to the line right here for view C. And me measuring it, it was, let's make sure, it was about 21 3/4 inches. Well, I wanted mine to account for the seam allowance, and the seam allowance is 1 1/4. I went ahead and made mine 23 1/4 inch long, which will give me 22 inches from the sleeve, the top, to the hem will be 22 inches, which is what I wanted. So therefore, I went ahead and make those adjustments. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and trace around my pattern. Now, the first thing I do is I mark X's in the corners when I'm tracing off a pattern. Now, I need to make sure that my bust, now on this pattern, I cut a size 14. On this pattern is showing a bust of 40 1/2 inches. Well, to accommodate for seam allowance, I am doing 43 inches. So therefore, I'm going to do 43 1/2. That means that I need to enlarge this pattern by 3 inches. Now, please note that this is just the front. So I need to divide that by 4. So I'm going to grab a calculator just real quick to divide this by 4. Okay, so I grabbed a calculator, and because, like I said, this is 40 1/2 inches, I want 43 1/2. That means that I'm going to enlarge the entire bust by 3 inches. So I need to take that 3 inches and divide it by 4. That means that I need to enlarge the bust by 0.75 or 3/4 inches to the front and to the back. Now we know your back does not have bust, but you need to make that line at the waist, at the bust line, in order to enlarge that back pattern piece by 0.75 as well. You do not want to add all 3 inches to the front pattern pieces only. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and mark where this dart is, right here at this line. I'm going to come out 3/4 of an inch and make a dot. So I'm going to make my dot right here. Now, I'm going to go down to the waist. Now, looking at my finished garment measurement, and I'm doing view C, and I cut out 1 B, so I'm a B cup in this, on this pattern. So I'm going to go to the 40.5 for the finished garment measurement for B. Now, when I go up to a size 14, it shows a waist measurement of 28. Well, I need to add 4 inches because my waist is a 32. So divide that by 4 as well, because you cutting on a fold, so you have front and back is 2. And then, I'm sorry, front is 2 and back is 2. So you need to divide that 4 inches by 4, which gives you 1. So therefore you need to add, if you're doing the same measurements as me, you need to add 1 inch. So I'm going to take my ruler and add 1 inch at the waist. And then there's no real reason why you would need a hip measurement unless you're doing it longer than where I'm cutting it off. My pattern is being cut off right underneath the belly button, so I would not need to account for my hips. Now, after I have made my dot here for my bust and my dot here for my waist, I'm going to match them up in order to create the new pattern. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is trace around my pattern. All right. Make sure you go in and mark where your notches are going to be. Make sure you mark out your bust point as well. Now my bust point is the 14th, so I'm still going to mark that 14 right here. I'm going to mark out my notches. Everything that you would do if you was not adjusting this pattern. All right, now make sure when you lift the pattern piece up that you have all your dots that you need. Okay, I'm gonna lift it up and I'm gonna make sure I mark my dot right there as well. All right, so the next thing that I'm going to do is at this, I'm gonna put some tape down. Just be careful, if you do not need to put tape, then don't worry about it. So the next thing I'm gonna do is move my bust, the pattern where my bust was right here. I'm gonna move that pattern out to the bust. So making sure your pattern stay where it needs to stay and just move it out to the bust to where that line is now touching that dot for your bust. And then you want to draw in that new line. Now, also, while you're at the bust, you want to make sure that you also move it out to where your new line for your waist is. You just want the pattern piece to touch that line that you went out to. and then you're going to draw in your new line. And mark your notches as well and your new placement for your dart. And transfer any notches you may have as well. After you do that, place your pattern back in its original position. And what you want to do is you're going to go ahead and cut out your pattern piece following the new line that you just created. You're going to do the same exact adjustment on the back pattern piece. Now, before you go to your back pattern piece, go ahead and draw in your dart. And I'm going to go ahead and straighten up my lines as well. And if you cannot cut without having the lines connected, just go ahead and connect all your lines as well. Once you do that, go ahead and go to the back pattern piece and do the exact same thing. All right, so now that we have made the modifications to our front and back pattern piece, let's talk about the pattern pieces you will need in order to construct this boxy top. So the first pattern piece you will need is pattern piece number 1, which is the front. Now this pattern is one that has different size cups. So you need to pick your cups based on your upper and lower bust. So if you take the instructions, let me pull out the instructions for you. So if you look right here in the instructions, it'll say bust cup size. So you need to measure your upper bust and your bust right at the fullest part of your bust. And then based off of if you're 1 to 2 inches, you're a B cup, 2 to 3 inches, you're a C cup. If the difference is 3 to 4 inches, you're a D cup, and anything between 4 and 5 inches is a double D. So make sure you are looking at this section and pick your cup size to cut based off of those measurements. And that was the front pattern piece. You're going to cut 1 unfolded fabric. The next pattern piece you will need is pattern piece number 2, which is the back pattern piece. You need to cut 2. The next pattern piece is pattern piece number 3, which is your front facing. You need to cut 1 unfolded fabric and 1 unfolded interfacing. The next pattern piece is pattern piece number 4. This is your back facing, and you need to cut 2 of fabric, and you're going to interface 2 as well. The next pattern piece is pattern piece number 12. This is your sleeve ruffle. You need to cut 2 of fabric if you want the ruffle in your sleeve. If you do not have to worry about cutting this piece. The next pattern piece is pattern piece number 11, which is the sleeve. You need to cut 2. And that's all the pattern pieces that you will need in order to construct your boxy top. However, what I am doing is instead of the button closure in the back, I will be creating ties. Now, I created my tie ends by doing 21.5 inches long by 3 inches high, and you're going to need to cut 2 of fabric. Now that we have talked about all the pattern pieces you will need, let's go ahead and start sewing our boxy top. All right, so let's go ahead and start with our boxy top. So the first pattern piece you're going to need is pattern piece number 1. So grab pattern piece number 1, which is your front. So basically what you're going to do is go ahead and stay stitch around the neck area in the directions of the arrow. So I started at the back, went to one end, and then turned it over, started in the back, and went to the other end. After I did the stay stitching, I went ahead and made my darts at the front of my top. So now that I have done that, I'm going to go ahead and put my front pattern piece, which is pattern piece 1. Now, like I said, make sure you are using the right cup size for yours. Mine's is 1B, so I'm just going to go ahead and put that aside and grab pattern piece number 2, which is my back. Now, another thing I did was I went ahead and stay stitched my neck edge on the back as well. And I went ahead and serged my raw edge, which is my center back. Now, what I'm going to do now is go ahead and put right sides together. And then you have notches. So make sure you are pinning at your notch right there. So I'm going to pin at my notch. And then there's a dot. Make sure you are pinning at your dot as well. If you are not sure where your dot is, go ahead and grab your pattern piece. So I'm going to have to grab my pattern piece again because I cannot see my dot. And the dot looks to be about right here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and move my pattern piece. I can see it now. So it's right there. So I'm going to pin at the dot as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and pin at the very bottom. And then place some pins in a few more places. Now, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and then sew all the way up to the dot and backstitch at the end and press my seams open. All right, so I went ahead and attached the center back and pressed it open. Now, above this dot right here where I stopped, I went ahead and made sure I pressed that open as well. And this is 5/8 of an inch. So get your seam gauge and make sure that you are pressing this top portion, which is actually your button closure. But instead of me doing a button closure, I am doing ties in the back. So I went ahead and pressed this at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I just used a index card and went ahead and pressed that as well. Now, go ahead and flip your back pattern piece over. And go ahead and grab your front pattern piece. And with right sides together, you want to attach your front to your back at the shoulders. And go ahead and pin at your shoulders. And using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, backstitch at the beginning and at the end and sew across both shoulders. All right, so I went ahead and sewn the shoulder seams together and went ahead and finished off my shoulder seams. I'm gonna go ahead and put my top aside for just a second and grab my ties that I am creating for the back. Now this is completely optional. You do not have to do this. This is just a personal preference. So once again, my tie ends are 21.5 inch long by 3 inches high. So when I fold them in half, it's going to be 1.5 inches actually when you fold them in half. And I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So what I did is on one end, I went ahead and pressed up a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then with the right sides together, I went ahead and pinned the length of the ties. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew using 1/2 inch seam allowance just along the long edge. So I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and also back stitch at the end using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, so I went ahead and sewn my ties, trimmed it down. So I did right sides together, just to recap, right sides together. I pressed up a 1/2 inch on one side, right sides together, pinned it, sewn using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, trimmed it down. Once I trimmed it, I went ahead and turned it right side out with my loop turner, and then went ahead and gave it a nice press. Now that the ties are done, go ahead and put them aside for a second and grab your facing piece. Now grab pattern piece number 4. So you'll need 3 and 4, but I'm just going to work on pattern piece number 4 quickly. Now I am going to go ahead and mark my dot again because I cannot see it on the wrong side, but I can see it on the right side. So it's perfectly fine not to mark it again. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pin at that dot. So my dot is right here. So I'm going to pin at that dot. With right sides together, I'm going to start at the bottom. I'm going to turn it over. So I'm going to start at the bottom, back stitch at the bottom, and sew using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and stop right here at the dot, and then press your seams open. All right, so I stitched with right sides together. I back stitch at the beginning and came up to the dot, and then back stitch at the dot. And then I pressed the seams open from the bottom to that dot. Now with right sides together, go ahead and grab your front facing and you want to pin at the shoulders. So you're going to pin at the shoulders on both shoulder seams. So pin at your notch. And then the other one, you're going to pin at the notch as well. And using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end and sew across both shoulder seams. All right, so now that I have sewn the facings together at the shoulder seam, what you're going to do is go ahead and finish off the outside edge. You can use your pinking shears. You could turn under 1/4 of an inch, press, and then stitch there, or you could serge it. I'm just going to go ahead and serge it quickly and show you what it looks like. All right, so I went ahead and finished off the edge of my facing. So go ahead and grab your ties. So what I did is I completely just basted 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, just kind of just a little bit, just to show where 5/8 was. So what I'm going to do is place one of my ties, and I'm going to place it right underneath that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to pin. And I'm going to pin on both sides. And then I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, grabbing one of my ties and place it right underneath that 5/8 of an inch marking that I made. Now I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and I'm going to baste this down using 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. All right, so now that I have basted my ties 5/8 of an inch from the back facing, so I came down 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and basted using 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. So go ahead and grab your bodice or your top. All right, so with right sides together, you're going to pin your facing to your top. So I'm going to start at the back. So this is my back. My back is facing up with right sides facing. So I'm going to pin starting at my back. So just make sure that you have the back sides facing down. And make sure you keep your ties free to where it doesn't get caught in anything. All right. So you want to make sure that that press edge that you press in, you want to turn it out. You want to make sure that it is not folded onto itself. So just go ahead and pull that out. Pin at your notch, which is a notch right here, pin there. And then you want to also pin down the press edge of the back piece where you pressed it. So you're going to pin all the way to that dot. And try to do the best that you can, pinning all the way to that dot. And then you're going to pin the all the way around and pin at that other dot on the other side as well. So go ahead and do that. All right, so using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to start at the dot, back stitch at the dot, come up, and then pivot, go all the way around your neck. And then when you get to this corner, you're going to pivot, come down, and back stitch at the end at this dot. Back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and then trim your seams and your corners, and also clip into any curves that you may have. All right, so now that I have attached my facing to my top, I'm gonna go ahead and trim down the seam allowance to roughly about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim, and then I'm gonna clip into my curves and clip my corners. All right. So now that I have clipped into my neck edge, I'm going to go ahead and turn it out. Poke out that edge where the tie is so you get a nice clean finish. And now what you want to do is make sure that your seam allowance is up towards your facing. So press your seam allowance up towards your facing, and then you want to understitch on your facing. It's to catch this seam allowance. So go ahead and do your understitching about 1/4 of an inch from the seam. So make sure you are stitching your 1/4 of an inch on your facing. So go ahead and do that. All right, so I went ahead and understitched my neck area. I gave it a really good press, turned it to the inside, and then what I did was I went ahead and tacked the facing at the shoulder seams, so both shoulder seams, to make sure it's not flopping around or whatnot. And then this area right here, which is the back facing, I went ahead and just took a hand needle and kind of stitched that to where that's not flopping around as well. So go ahead and do that. And once you're done with that, go ahead and put your top aside for a second so we could construct our sleeves. Now, one thing you can do it right here, but I will not be doing it right here because I want to sew my sleeves and my side seams together in one continuous stitch. So, but what you can do is you can go ahead and do right sides together and go ahead and sew your side seam if you would like to do it that way, following the instructions, but I will not be sewing my side seam together at this moment. I will go ahead and construct my sleeves and then sew my side seams in one continuous stitch. So go ahead and put your top aside and go ahead and work on, let's go ahead and work on your sleeves. Okay, so now that I have pattern piece number 11, which is your sleeve. So the first thing you want to do is make 2 rows of gathering stitches along your sleeve cap. So I did 2 rows of gathering stitches based using the longest stitch on my sewing machine. I did from notch to notch. After you do that, with right sides together, you want to pin your underarm seams. So go ahead and match that right sides together and pin. And then using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end and go ahead and finish off your seams. All right, so now that I have sewn my sleeves together, right sides together, I went ahead and finished off the underarm seam, and then I went ahead and hem. Now, one thing I want to mention, because I should have done this before I stitched my underarm seam, go ahead and hem your sleeve in place first before you attach your underarm seams with right sides together, pin and sewing 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. It would make your life a lot easier because it's harder to get the hem in place and stitch it once you sew the underarm seam. So that's just a rule of thumb. I did it differently this time, but I normally stitch my hem in place before I stitch the underarm seams together. So now that I have the sleeve sewn together, go ahead and put it aside for just 1 second. Grab your ruffle. Now I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to do because I'm going to go ahead and do this off camera. So what you want to do is right sides together. You want to pin your ruffles at that notch. So pin the notch and pin in the other 2 areas. And then you want to take it to the sewing machine and using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and finish off your seam allowance. Once you do that, you're going to press your seams to one side. It doesn't matter which side you press it to, just press your seams to one side. Once you do that, you're going to create a 5/8 of an inch basting stitch along the top and along the bottom. Once you do that, you're going to go to the ironing board, press to that line all the way around, top and bottom, and then you're going to go ahead and press again to form a narrow hem at the top and at the bottom. So go ahead and do that. All right, so once you make your narrow hem at the top and at the bottom of your ruffle, you want to go ahead and create 2 rows of gather at whichever one that you're using for the top. You're gonna make 2 rows of gather all the way around, pull to gather onto your sleeve. Now I have done this already for 1 sleeve, so I'm just gonna show you what I did, and then you can finish off the rest of it. So basically you're gonna create gathers. Let me turn it to the right side. I'm sorry. So it's going to look like this. So you're going to have a little ruffle at the end of your sleeve. So I did that. So then what you want to do is, if you did not do it already, you want to put right sides together for your top. Grab your top. And with right sides together, you want to go ahead and pin your underarm seams. So pin your underarm seams and using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You're going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end and finish off your seam allowance. So go ahead and do that. All right, so now that I went ahead and sewn my side seams and I went ahead and finished off my side seams, I'm going to turn it right side out. Now here's a good time for you to try your top on to make sure it fits. If not, you can make those adjustments if you need to. I already tried mine on, mine fit, but I haven't made so many tops, so... All right, so basically what I'm going to do is go ahead and insert the sleeve. So I'm just going to show you how to go ahead and pin it. Now, this is the back of my top right here. So you should have 2 notches in the back and 1 notch in the front. So when you grab your sleeves, you want to do right sides together, matching up the sleeve. Now this is the back of my sleeve, so this is the wrong armhole, so you want to switch to the other side, and then with right sides together you want to pin the seams. Make sure that your seams are facing the back of your garment, and then I'm just going to pin. I'm going to pin at those double notches right here. Now you should have 2 rows of gathering stitches, and that's for you to pull up the sleeve cap to make sure that it fits into the sleeve hole. So just make sure that you do that. So I'm going to pin at this 1 notch right here, and then after I pin at that 1 notch, I'm going to make sure that I go ahead and put the sleeve on the inside and then pin around, pulling up the gathers for the sleeve cap to fit. Once you do that, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to sew around your sleeve and then finish off your seam allowance. Once you finish off your seam allowance and insert the sleeve on both sleeves, you're going to go ahead and press up 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and hem your, and then sew your hem. Once you do that, you are all done. So there you have it. You have just finished sewing your second version of the boxy top. So like, comment, and subscribe, and also turn on that notification bell so you are up to date and you are notified every time I upload a new video. If you haven't done it already, I advise you, come here. Go subscribe so you're not missing any of my videos. So without further ado, like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, keep sewing.